I am pretty enthusiastic about this video. I'm enthusiastic about every video in this course, but this one is particularly cool. This is probably the most advanced video that I've had so far in this course. What we are going to do here is integrate a lot of the concepts that we've already learned about control statements and importing data. And so what we are going to do is import data in the most flexible way, which is also, it can get to be a little bit complicated and sometimes a little bit confusing, but this is really the most flexible way to import data into Matlab. You're going to learn several new functions in this video, including fid file identifier, fgetL, which is file get line, this reads a line from a file, and fprintf, so we're also going to learn how to export data, in particular mixed text and numeric data from Matlab into a text file using fprintf. So I'm going to get started by showing you what the data file looks like. So this is a text data that I have open here in Notepad. This is the data file that we want to import data from. Now notice that this is not a very conveniently formatted file. So we have a bunch of text at the top that we're going to need to ignore. This is not data, this is just text. The data are actually starting here. They start on this line here. So it's actually just 2 lines of data. And what makes this file particularly annoying to read is that we have different types of data, different variables stored in different columns. So notice we have the word trial, that's an indicator, and then data value 1. And then choice, and then data value 2. RT stands for reaction time. It doesn't actually matter what it stands for. So the point is that the organization of the rows on line 1 is different from the organization of the rows on line 2. So in fact, this value, this data value, corresponds to this data value. So these really should be in the same column. Likewise, these 2 data values correspond. They should be in the same column. Now, you could certainly make an argument that whoever created this data file was really either a very stupid person or a very mean person, because this is a terrible, terrible way to organize data. But the point here, of course, is not about the data. The point is to make this hard on purpose so that we have to really learn a lot about using Matlab to import data files. Okay, so this just shows you what the data look like. So let's see, now we switch to Matlab, and what we're going to do is use a function called fopen, and fopen will open a pointer to the file on the hard disk, and it returns a variable called fid, or file identifier. So the way that fopen works is you input the file name, so this is called headache-data.txt, and of course I don't have a path here, so that means that I am assuming that the data file is either in our current working directory, which it is, or that this file must be in the Matlab path. And if that's not the case, you've already learned in previous videos that you can specify a full header in here, a full path in here. Okay, and then the second input here is R in single quotes. This R stands for read. We are going to read from this file. Now later on in the video, you will see another option of W, and that is for writing to the file. But first we want to read to this file. So now I run this line of code. Now I get this variable fid. It looks like it's the number 3. And if I type whose, you can see that this appears to be just a normal number. But in fact, Matlab is just printing this out as a 3. In fact, internally, Matlab is using this number as a guide, as a pointer to a specific file locate, so some address on your hard drive. Now, you're always going to get some number. It's often 3 if it's the first file that you're importing. But I would like to show you what happens if we say, so I'm just adding a 5 here, just so we have a file name that doesn't exist. This is not a file that actually exists. And then Matlab returns -1 for fid. So if ever you see that you're trying to open a file, you're trying to read from a file, and this file identifier variable is -1, then you have a problem. It means that Matlab cannot find that file. Okay, so I need to run this again, actually. Okay, now notice it turned into 4. Okay, so this doesn't actually import the data. This just gives us a pointer to the location of the data on the hard drive. So what we are going to do here in this while loop is import the data line by line. So I'm going to initialize the data. Now I don't know a priori how big the data is going to be. So it's not possible to initialize the data as zeros, maybe it's like 15 rows and 4 columns. But in this particular case, I don't know how big the data is going to be. So initializing this to be an empty matrix, I can show you what this looks like. It's just an empty matrix. So my data is just empty. That basically just reserves the name in the Matlab buffer, the name of the variable. And if we previously have imported or worked with or created a variable called myData, this will clear out myData to make sure that we're starting from scratch. Okay, so now what we do here is we stay in this while loop. Remember, from a few videos ago, I said that you should prefer a while loop over a for loop when you don't know exactly how many iterations you're going to need. And that is the case here. We don't know how long this file is a priori. Okay, so what is the conditional here? The conditional here is, it looks like FUF. This is actually file, end of file. And then we have the input fid. So what this function is doing is testing whether the pointer to the file is currently at the end of the file or if it's not at the end of the file. So if we just run this here, this pointer is actually now pointing to the beginning of the file. We haven't read in any of the file, so we're pointing to the very beginning of the file. So that means this returns false because we are not at the end of the file. But we want to keep importing data as long as we are not at the end of the file. So that's why we have to negate it here. So this turns out to be true. And when we get to the end of the file, when we finish reading all of the lines in the data file, then this will return false, and that breaks us out of this while loop. Okay, so that's about the while loop. Next, we have this line, a line equals fgetL fid. So this stands for file get line. This is the letter L, not the number 1. So we get a line of data from the file, and that's going to be returned into this character array a line. So let's run this once and see what it looks like. So here is a line, variable a line, and the result is, or what's contained in this variable is this text. This is a text file with mixed strings and numbers. And here, let me show you this text file again, just so you can see. So the first line in this text file, and a line in a text file, is separated by a carriage return. The carriage return character is an invisible character. It's typically not actually printed, but it's the character that appears when you press the Enter key on your keyboard. So we get the first line here, including the space. Notice there's a space here, and there's actually a space in the data file over here. So let me get this out of the way. Now, what we want to do is separate this line. We want to split up this piece of character, this character array, into separate words. And we do that by using this function, regexp. This stands for regular expression. If you're familiar with working with Unix systems, then you might already know a little bit about this kind of a function, regular expression. So the way that we are going to use it here is by inputting some text, and that is literally the line of code or the line of data that we read in from this file. And then we want to split up this piece of string, this character array, according to tabs. So let's see what that looks like. So that actually converts this whole thing into a cell. So we went from having this variable a line be a character array, and now it's one cell. Now this might not seem very useful because there's no tabs on this line, so we just get one cell. So we haven't really done a whole lot of useful stuff. But it turns out that in this data file, the actual data is tab delimited. You can see these are not spaces. This is a tab here separating these different columns here. Okay, so what do we do with this? Well, essentially we want to look for the keyword trial, because I happen to know, so of course to import a data file, you have to know something about that data file. I know that all of the valid lines of data have the keyword trial in them, and all of the other lines of data in this file that do not contain a tab delimited, a tab separated string called trial, we don't care about those data lines. So then I'm saying I'm using this if-then construction here, and I'm saying string compare trial to a line. So this function string compare is going to compare this string to every cell in this array. So let's see what this function returns. Okay, so we get the answer of false. So it's a logical, and the answer is false. And the reason why it's false is because Matlab is comparing this string here, this character array trial, to each cell in, or each element in this cell array align. So this whole thing together is not the same thing as this. These two things are not equal, and that's why Matlab returns false. Okay, now we have this funny looking line here. This says continue and nothing else. You can see it's a keyword. It's the same color font as if and else and while. Now, when Matlab encounters this continue function, it's going to break out of this control statement, and then it's going to skip all the rest of the code in the higher level control statement. So that means that all of this code does not get run, and instead Matlab is going to continue to the next iteration. So from here, when this is true, and it is in this case, this is true, then this statement gets run, and Matlab will ignore the rest of the code in the while statement, go back up to the top of the while statement, which means we read in another line of code. Now I'm going to run this again, and we get a different line, and I'm going to keep running this until we get to the actual first line of code that we care about. And okay, so that's this one. So now I would like to reiterate that a line is a character array, and then what we do here is convert that character array, which looks like this, into a cell array, and that looks like this. So now we have each word is separated by a tab, so they all go into their own separate cell. So previously it was a 34 element character array, and now it is an 8 element string array. Each word is its own string. Now we can see when we type string compare, we get a Boolean vector. It is 1 or true, and then all zeros or false. And these are all false because Matlab is comparing this character array to each element of this cell. So here, these match here. This doesn't match. This is not equal to trial. This is not equal to trial. This is not equal to trial, and so on. So that gives us true, and the rest of these are all falses. Now when this, and then I use any, and any returns whether any one of the inputs is true. So you can see there's one true and all falses, and then I encase this in the any function, and we get true. And we get true here because any one of these is true. Okay, and then I negate that. So in fact, this whole statement here is false. So this continue statement does not get run. And that means we actually pass through to the next part of the while loop. Okay, and so now you will remember from this data file that every line, every row of data has a different organization. So what we need to do is find which column in this particular line contains the keyword trial and the keyword choice and the keyword RT and the keyword accuracy. And then we know that the actual trial value, the number value that we need, is in the next column after trial. And that is the point of this line of code here, or these 4 lines of code here. So we are using this same function that I used here, string compare trial to a line, except instead of just wanting to know if any of these elements are true, I want to know which one is true. And so for that, I use the find function. Now let me start by showing you this, because this first one is actually going to be slightly confusing. I think this one will be a little bit clearer. So here we get false, false, true, and then the rest falses. So you can see visually, it's obvious that the true element is the third element. So 1, 2, 3, the third element is true. And that is what the find function is going to return for us. So it's going to return the number 3 because that's telling us that it's the third element in this vector that is true. Now the reason why I said it's going to be a little confusing here is because trial appears in the first column. So this is actually the logical, the Boolean true. And when I use find, it's going to be the number true. So you can see it's just so happens to be a little confusing here. Okay, so that tells us where each of the important variable names are in the cell array of a line. Okay, and then the data that we actually want is in that cell array element plus 1. So this tells us, you know, the first column is trial, and we want the value of the trial observation is in the trial plus 1 column. Right, so that's what this does. And now the thing is, this is actually text. This is a character one, but we want the number one. So I'm using this function, string to double, to convert this string one into a number, a double precision number one. All right, and that finally gives us our first row of data. I haven't run this line yet. So finally, that gives us our first row of data. So you see that the variable myData now has one row. This was the trial. This was the, what was this next one? The choice. This one was RT, and this one was accuracy. And then we have to increment the row. Okay, so then the final thing that we do here is to close the file. So we have a file that's open. We've opened the file. Matlab has opened up this text file. And here we use this function fclose to close the file. If you don't run this line of code and you try to work with that file in your operating system, depending on the program you're using to open the file, you might actually get an error message in your operating system that says that the file is opened by some other application. So whenever you use fopen to import a data from a data file, to read from a data, it's important to use fclose at the end. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is run this line of code, and then I'm going to press Control Enter to run all of the code in this cell. So that imports the entire data file, and we can see that we get 2 rows of data, and this is obviously a much nicer format compared to that horrible formatted text file that I just showed you. All right, so that is for the advanced but most flexible way to import data from the hard disk into Matlab. Now, this video went on for a little while, so I'm going to cut here and show you writing out data, just one data, in the next video. So take a deep breath, go have a glass of orange juice or whatever, and come back, and I will see you in the next video.